Me and Christian are dissenters of the activist left, and we are very typical of the activist left in our own backgrounds. My father is a scholar, journalist, worked in the Clinton administration. Christian's father is was an academic professor, of course, a critic of the U.S. government, very notable. But these were that we come from the kind of background that people in the activist left come from. They're not coming from the grassroots blue collar Rust Belt union world.
Okay, that was fascinating, watching that short film, and there's so much to think about there. So my name's Willie Maley, and I'm joined by Dov and Jeanette. We're going to introduce ourselves. I'm going to begin by saying a little bit about myself, just very briefly. So my father, James Maley, fought in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. He was captured at Jarama in February 1937 and held prisoner for several months. My father was born in Glasgow in 1908. He died in Glasgow in 2007. So, and I'm the same, a lifelong Glaswegian living in the same city. My father was a labourer, that was his work. He never did any. He had no formal schooling. He left school at 14. Neither my mother or father went to university. None of my grandparents went to university. I'm the 7th of 9 children and the first in my family to go to university. And I'm a university professor now, and I recognise that there are all kinds of issues involved in higher education that relate to some of the things we're going to discuss. And I've seen them from the inside, and also had an opportunity to look at them a little bit from the outside. So that's my schooling in anti-fascism, if you like, came through my father, who joined the Communist Party in 1932. He was invited to May Day in Moscow in the same year, 1932, and he remained as active as he could be politically for most of his life. But my politics came from class politics. A father who was Scottish from an Irish background, who was very anti-British imperialism, anti-British state even, and that's where I take my, if you like, the beginnings of my political. And only since my father's death in 2007 have I begun to historicise that and to think about it in a different way. So instead of being just the son of an international brigadier, I've become someone who's interested in the 1930s, who's interested in Spanish Civil War, and then the aftermath and the long history of communism and empire and so on. I'm going to hand over now to Jeanette.
Okay, thank you, Willie. So pleased to be here with you too. And I was born in Peterborough, Ontario, where my father went after he had been chased out of Saskatoon by the RCMP. He went to the United States for a year and spent the winter in New York City before coming back to Canada. And he came to Peterborough, I know now, because I edited and published his book in 2020, but I started that in 2017. And that's when I found out about my father. I'd had a glimpse in 1978 of what he was about, other than what I had seen of him, that he worked in a factory, he was active in his union, he was active in left-wing politics. That was all I knew. And his past was a mystery to all of us. I have 4 siblings, and I'm the oldest of the 4. And he met my mother in 1942. So we didn't know anything about his life before that. And I realize now it's because he had come to Peterborough. He met my mother, married her within a couple of short years. And he was only there because he'd been surveilled by the RCMP. So in 1976, we children asked him to write his story. We wanted to know about his past. And we all got together, we ganged up on him at Christmas that year and said, Dad, you've got to write about your past. This is good therapy for you. He did. He took it seriously. I hadn't really realized how seriously he took us. But the man I know now is extremely different from the man I knew back then. And the glimpse I had back then was shortly after he wrote in 1977, through an incredible series of coincidences, which I won't go into. He was found by a young boy he saved during the Spanish Civil War. Now, that became international news, and that boy was Manuel Alvarez. He wrote a book called The Tall Soldier, my 40-year search for the man who saved my life. So my father was seen as a hero. That's when I began to get an idea that, oh, my father wasn't such an ordinary man after all. But it was only when I edited his memoir and found out his story. I hadn't read it before 2017. I have to shamefully admit, I had life to live. I had things to do. It took me 3 years to produce this book and document it and so on. So, and my background came, I'll just mention, I have a degree in sociology, and I focused on the sociology of work and organization. So I did get into labor issues and some of the issues that are relevant to this book. I'd also published before books, so when it came to publishing, I kind of knew what I was doing. So that's me.
Fantastic. So Dov.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my name's Dov Osheroff, and my dad's name was Abe Osheroff, and he also fought in Spain. I don't actually know the exact details of that. Like, I think he was there less than a year. He was wounded pretty severely, so was recuperated near Barcelona after being shot, and never made it back to fight. I think he did some training of new arrivals for a minute before coming back to the States. Let's see. So he was born in Brooklyn, grew up in Brownsville, which was a Jewish community at the time, and Yiddish speaking. His parents were both, my grandparents are both immigrants from, I guess, Russia. It's not totally clear where they were from. Those places don't exist anymore. And no one ever wrote down the names. There were small shtetls, little, dirt road villages, Jewish communities that they left during a heightened period of pogroms and anti-Semitic violence there under the Tsar. And they met in New York. And he had a younger sister there and grew up in Brownsville. Let's see. He, in his description, he always had, his folks were not particularly political. They were secular Jews. And like, I think many secular Jews, they took the sort of intellectual side of Judaism, of like sort of questioning questions of ethics and what's the right way to be. So I think he was encouraged to be intellectually curious, even though they weren't, neither were they educated or particularly political, but nonetheless supported his precociousness. And he was very good at school, very smart, very curious. He wasn't accepting of what he was told. He always wanted to figure it out for himself. And he had that spirit. So anyway, he was sort of inherently radical in that sense. I imagine this is common to many of the folks that volunteered for Spain, and became political in his teen years with the Depression when it hit, and so he told stories about like people being evicted. These are poor Jewish working class folks, his neighbors, and he and other they sort of organized some of the young men in the community. And the way the evictions worked then, is before eviction law, I think, the landlord would send some people and they'd take their stuff out and throw it out on the street and close the door and you were evicted. So what they would do is take the stuff and carry it back up and put it back in the apartment. And they'd play this game with the landlords until the landlords got tired, since there wasn't anybody going to replace the tenant anyway, and would give up, spending money to have someone come there and forcibly remove people. So that sort of stuff got him thinking, and And the way he tells it, the first people that made sense to him were communists. And that was because they were the first people that spoke about the actual reality he saw in his daily life and tried to explain it in some way that made sense, that added up. They're talking about capitalism and class stuff. And so he became a member of the Communist Party as a young person, and that inevitably led to his going to Spain. I think most of the recruits, volunteers from the United States made their way to Spain through the Communist Party. I don't know if that's true in Canada or in Scotland and Britain,
That's
but
the case internationally. I think that was the case, that the
Right.
Communist Party was really the funnel through which.
right. So that's how he ended up in Spain, and then I was born in Venice, California, or born in Los Angeles, and grew up in Venice, California, on the West Coast, opposite side of the country. And he ended up there and met my mother because he was underground during the McCarthy era. And he got a tip off from an old neighborhood friend who now was an FBI person that he was going to be picked up. This is out in New York. And so he took off and was sort of going around the country picking up odd jobs. So he ended up in LA when things calmed down. And that's where myself and my brother and sister were born. And then what else did I say about him? So I grew up there with him. He and my mother split up when I was 9, 10, when I was fairly young. And but he didn't, he stayed in the neighborhood and was an active presence. And we stayed close until he died, which was 2008. So I think that's kind of it. Yeah.
That was a really rich account, and it obviously has resonances too, because I'm sure that certainly I can say for myself that local activism, anti-evictions and so on, the hunger marches, all the things that were happening in the 1920s and 1930s, most of our fathers, grandfathers, and certainly the volunteers for Spain were involved in those anti-fascist, opposing the anti-immigration gatherings and so on, and right from the early 30s. So I think there's definite commonalities there. And you began to move into McCarthy, and I was thinking of McCarthyism didn't happen in Britain or in Scotland under that name, but there was obviously the Cold War and the beginnings of a real sustained anti-communism and anti-communist panic, really. So maybe just to think about after the war, what was their career? And that's relevant for my own father, because my father was very bright at school, although he wasn't trained, and he fought in Burma and went to India and fought in Burma. And after the war, he worked in a hospital for a short time in Burma. Then he came back to Glasgow, and he said he made a mistake. It was a kind of Great Gatsby mistake. He took his uniform off. He'd been working for a period in the barracks in Glasgow as a kind of telephone engineer. So he was operating the telephones. When he came back, he got into this. And then he went for a job in the telephone exchange in Glasgow, and he had taken off his uniform. As he said, he was a working class man with an Irish surname. And he felt that because of discrimination, anti-Catholic discrimination, which existed in Glasgow, and anti-communist prejudice, cost him the chance to do anything other than, in the end, he was a lifelong labourer. He was working on building sites and stuff like that. So it was an absolute, at the lowest level of a working man, if you like. So that was his big, and that was partly the fallout from the Second World War. So he remained locally active. He remained a member of the Communist Party till it crumbled about his ears. So he was basically a lifelong member of the Communist Party. Sold the Morning Star door to door, and was very kind of active in local campaigns, tenants association, and so on, and within his union. So he did, and he remained interested. My father was very anti-nostalgia, so he had no interest in harking back for the sake of it, or a few years trapped in amber. Up until the very end of his life, within days of his dying in 2007, he had the Atlas out looking at Sudan and looking at parts of the world. He was interested in the world and everything that was happening. And it always astonishes me how from the early 1930s, as a young man, he knew what was happening globally, and that people knew about what was happening in Italy and what was happening in Spain and so on, not just from 1936, but earlier than that, and yet because they had obviously the Daily Worker, but they had other kind of sources of knowledge. And I think there was a lot of street corner and public meeting. And my father became a public speaker in 1932. He used to go with his little portable platform and speak. So my father's post-war story is one of, he got married. He was the father of 9 children. We lived in a very poor neighbourhood, a notoriously poor neighbourhood of Glasgow. So I think the story was one of poverty, continuing commitment to communism, but without any nostalgia for the 1930s. Really, a communism that was very, and a outlook that was very much grassroots, had a very local base. He didn't travel. I don't think he went back to Spain in '96, I think, or '97 for a Jarama reunion thing, '97 maybe. But he never, he wasn't a globetrotter or a traveller. He was very much rooted in the city of his birth. So that would say a little bit about my father's. So his career was, he was a labourer. He worked on building sites. He worked for the railway for a time, but as basically the person who lifted the tracks onto to lay the tracks, a track layer. So he was a lifelong labourer. My father was 65 when he retired. I was 12 years old. So he'd also, because he'd get married later, he had, he was like a kind of grandfather figure in some ways. But thinking about Jeanette was saying about, finding out things late. I mean, my father told us stories, particular ones like, being in, how unhygienic things were in prison in Spain, and also the fact that he drank out of the Irrawaddy River in Burma while dead bodies floated past. So my father had a kind of stomach of iron, very unsentimental about everything, and very anti-nostalgic. He didn't like sentiment. It didn't embarrass him. He just didn't like it because he felt it was very. And one story I would tell about my father, which happened at one post-war story, is the priest came to the door. Now, my father was brought up a Catholic. My mother was brought up Church of Scotland Protestant. But my father had kind of left the Catholic Church, but he was still a victim of anti-Catholic prejudice, because in Scotland, if your name is Irish, then you're assumed to be Catholic. But a priest came to the door because the name Maley was on the door. There were 9 children in the house. This suggested a Catholic household, and the priest put his foot in the door and said, "Turncoats." And my father said, "I couldn't be in heaven knowing that there was one person in hell. I couldn't be in heaven knowing that there was one person in hell." Well, we were cowering behind the door thinking, we don't get a say in this, but we might all be going to hell. But that was that was my father's attitude, and he had a very, throughout his life, he never drank or smoked. He didn't socialise much because his comrades kind of died before him, as it were. But he was very, very, he regularly got the Soviet Weekly and the Beijing Review, and read right across in a non-sectarian fashion all the socialist press. I mean, we had Stalin, Lenin, Mao, Trotsky, and all kinds of things on the bookshelf. So he was constantly, he was educating himself and reading on and so on, but very much interested in what was happening in the world today. So in that sense, he wasn't in the nostalgia kind of fest. So Jeanette, do you want to say a little bit about your father after the war?
Well, yes, and I realized I misunderstood in the first go round. I just did kind of a brief thing. I didn't talk about how my father's political consciousness developed, nor did I give his name. It's Jim Higgins. He was born in 1907 in London, and he was orphaned during the Great War and sent to an orphanage in Manchester, the Ardwick Industrial School, and he participated. I was amazed at the kind of extracurricular activities that were available to him. He excelled not only in swimming and boxing, but in his academics. And I have learned since, I just thought, well, okay, this is what happened to everybody in an orphanage. He got sent to a secondary school for 4 years, and he learned a trade. In half a day was spent on the trade, the afternoon. The morning was spent on academics. So he was, I think, kind of exceptional intellectually in a way as well that was recognized. He, when he was still at the Ardwick Industrial School, he stood up to a tyrannical teacher. His character was formed very, very young. Now, I only know all this stuff because of what he wrote and what's in the book. He emigrated to Canada in 1928. Of course, then went into the Depression, and the Depression is what really shaped him. In Canada, there were so many single unemployed men, and they were riding the rails back and forth across Canada, which is a huge expanse, looking for work. Eventually, the government set up relief camps. And my father was no longer able to organize unions as he had tried to do earlier in the Depression. He instead, in the relief camps, was working with the groups that were educating the working class. That's where their consciousness was really raised, where a large group of men who were unemployed, their consciousness was raised. And so that working class consciousness is something that he had. He was also very independent. He was an independent thinker. He talks about being taken to a Communist Party cell, and about the problem with union organizing in the early 1930s. And he and his friend who took him just thought that, you know, these leaders really didn't know what to do. They had no ideas. And so he was his own person. He called himself an individualist, but he was an independent thinker. That's what he meant by that. Today, individualist has a lot of negative connotations. Back then it didn't. He was in the On to Ottawa trek, which was that started in British Columbia and was stopped by police in Regina because the government of the day did not want to see this protest in Ottawa. And so they called it the Regina Riot. My father and his comrades called it the use of force to stop the trek. He was a member of the, in 1932, the CCF was formed. That's the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. So a social democratic party. And he joined that right away. But he had friends. They were all intermingling in the 1930s. You know, there was the Common Front policy that was introduced in 1935 by the Communist Party, realizing, I think, you know, people like Dove's father and your father too, that they were resonating with the working class, and nobody else really was. But the CCF was in the 1930s. And so my father volunteers as an anti-fascist in the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion in the International Brigades in the Spanish Civil War. And the thing, I'll just make a comment about where the information came from. I was astonished. I went back and read a year's worth of newspapers before and after, before he went to Spain, when he came back from Spain. It was Spanish Civil War was front page news the whole time, big headlines. There were lots of reporters there. They were reporting back to mainstream media as to what was going on. The public was informed. And the public was also very supportive of those trekkers in the On to Ottawa trek. They had a lot of sympathy from the general public. And those men, when they came back from Spain, were fighting, I mean, even before, they were fighting for wages, work for wages, unemployment insurance, medical health insurance, that sort of thing. And they won those rights. And it was all, that's when his political consciousness was really developed. Maybe I'll say something about a political party he was campaign managing in 1939, but I'll let Dove go now.
Well,
He died in 1982, by the way.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. I forgot to mention that my dad was a carpenter, as was his dad and his dad before him. And we used to joke, goes all the way back to Jesus Christ,
Yeah.
the worst carpenter to come out of Galilee in 2,000 years, but a good talker. So yeah, and I learned the trade, and myself and my brother are both carpenters as well. So yeah, definitely a working class reality, and therefore consciousness. And the way he told it is the community he was in it wasn't overt like a communist or socialist or anything, but it was given that there was basically a refugee community. People had, had fled to, somewhere between survive and be able to have enough food to eat, or survive violence, I should say, or have enough food to eat. So there was a, suspicion of authority. The police were not seen as your friend. The system wasn't there to protect you and take care of you. And you had to rely on your neighbors. You had to rely on the people you actually knew for your safety and for, to get through problems and any kind of difficulties. And people did that. So he grew up, as he would describe it, with just an innate sense of solidarity, not a political claim of solidarity, not an ideological position. It just was how life worked. And that's, I think, very true in immigrant communities in general, around the world, and in poorer communities. So that's how he grew up. Let's see, he really believed that the notion that a working class person, that there was some kind of tension or dividing line between an intellectual life and actually being a tradesperson, let's say, was completely ridiculous and a false, was a false notion. He didn't believe that. He thought working people, had lots of really great insights, and he worked very hard to develop this. He did go to university. He'd be the first person in the family ever to do that. He went to City University in New York, which at the time was pretty much a hotbed of emigres from Europe. Lots of people, lots of radical teachers there. And so he got a more sophisticated political education there. And I think that really helped him pull together his innate irreverence, his background, his upbringing and community experience, and sort of formed his capacity, which his whole life, I think very similar, sounds like all of our dads, free thinking, irreverent, never kind of signing up for anything without, kind of maintaining a certain independence of thought.
Yeah.
And seeing the questions of, basic questions of the 20th century, of humanity, of social justice stuff, as ongoing questions, not something you sort of got us a doctrine, sort of a book or a religious sort of truth about, and then you just wrote that out. That it was a process, and that situations change and times change, and you had to keep learning. You had to keep making things relevant, which is not true of everybody on the left, even of that generation. So
I think that idea of history being not an event but a process, and that the struggle of a continuing struggle, I think that's very much stitched into the fabric of our fathers' lives.
Yes, I don't think it's true of that entire generation. I knew people, some of his comrades and people that are very much not that way, and had sort of settled for what, as the years went by, looked like pretty mechanistic, repetitive, somewhat doctrinaire, sloganish kind of attitudes towards world events and towards questions that arose later. And so, but he certainly was that way, and he encouraged that in other people. He was really good about that. He was really. Later on, I read Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I really thought of my dad after that, like that he had. I don't think he knew who Paulo Freire was, but he or maybe he did, but anyway, that he practiced something similar, that he thought that people needed to draw on their own experience, not at the expense of book learning, not the expense of other types of knowledge, but it had to be that was the foundation, that you had to start with what you had actually experienced, what you saw in the world yourself, and build from there, not go and acquire a worldview from some, I don't know, from some source, like through education, let's say. And so he definitely supported that for myself and many other people. And what else would I say about that?
I mean, maybe that point you're making about your seeing your father and through the lens of reading the Paulo Freire and seeing your father as that kind of figure, autodidact, or someone who was a kind of a teacher who was a hub of knowledge of a much more politically engaged, non-institutional kind, and so on. I think that's something that some of us might share in terms of just thinking about our impressions as children of our fathers and how we saw them as, and when did we see them as historical figures? I mean, Jeanette has said it was later that you saw your father in this particular light. I think, Dov, you would have known this earlier, but maybe starting with Jeanette, how did you see your father before you knew of his, if you like, politics?
Well, he was just an ordinary father, worked in a factory. I didn't think about class so much. I saw that he had a lot of empathy. He loved to garden, and he was sort of typical of 1950s fathers in some ways, because they didn't really he didn't get involved in my life much. He certainly didn't preach anything about politics or anything. What he did was he lived, I learned by example from him. I absorbed through his values. I realize, especially now, he always cheered for the underdog, and I always have. I once told him I was a chip off the old shoulder, but I realize now I am not. I'm just a splinter. But he modeled an equal partnership in the marriage, which I think was unusual for the time. I think I recognized my parents were different from my friends' parents, and partly it's because I think they combined. He was working class, my mother was middle class, she had a university education. They had agreed, I now know from letters they wrote each other beforehand, that they would be partners, equal partners in life, and they modeled that for us, even though, I mean, she played kind of the typical role. She ended up having 5 children because birth control was so unreliable at that time. But it was equality that I saw, not equity. So that was really important to me through my life as well. And another reason that I admire him.
Excellent, thank you. So, Dov, what was your first sense of your father as a political, as it were?
Well, say that again.
What was your first sense of your father as a political figure?
Well, I mean, it was very obvious that his history wasn't like some kind of secret, or it wasn't some. He was an activist his whole life and kept involving himself in subsequent. He was down in Mississippi in '64, building a community center and working down there with Bob Moses. He never he never relinquished this appetite, basically, for engaging in these types of things. My parents' marriage was, I would say, pretty rough, and so I think that both disrupted. Also, when young children require a lot, and so I think he wasn't particularly active when I was a little kid. He was busy trying to be a family man. He was not well cut out for that. but I think he tried really hard. And but I think I viewed him as a little bit of I don't know if hypocrite's the right word, but I saw that that some of his the tension between his expressed or implied values and the way he actually acted sometimes didn't seem to match up when I was a kid. Now that was a child's perspective. I understand a little more now, being grown up and being in my second marriage now. But I was, sympathetic to my mother, and a little bit saw him as saw him a little bit through her eyes, I think. And so I fought with him a lot. I always respected him. I liked him. We're very similar, which is not true of my two siblings. They didn't feel nearly the sympathetic. They don't have the same kind of connection with him. But he and I were very similar. I think I had the same irreverence and the same unwillingness to, like men might have, be told what to do, but I was ready to be persuaded. So we fought a lot. But it was always, especially when I was older and I look back on it, it was always towards, like almost like a dialectic, a child and adult, a dialectic going on. I didn't know these types of words back then, but that's what we were doing. And he actually listened to me. He didn't, he basically would say, "You don't know what you're talking about." That's what would come out of his mouth when I would challenge him. But in the end, he'd actually think about it. Yeah. And I started to understand that we were in a give and take at some point. And this allowed me to stay close to him, even when I felt very put off by some of his behavior or some of his, even his politics, which we argued about a lot. So I think in the end, we kind of developed, we kind of worked at synthesizing across a generation gap. And I think, and this kind of gets into maybe what we'll talk about in a little while, but this might be a lot of what's missing culturally, that this doesn't happen too often, and that there's sort of the next generation starts over again, fresh. My parents' music sucks. My parents are, backward and live in the past. We're gonna, make this great new thing. We're gonna be counterculture people or whatever it is, and there's not much of a transfer of wisdom, of insight, of a historical, these sort of ineffable things as well as overt things. So I don't feel like I suffered from that. I feel like I got this huge, I don't know what you call it, inheritance. That's not quite the right word, but I learned so much from him. And I would say he learned a lot from me as a younger person growing up in a different time. That helped him stay relevant, and helped him, he took that in and processed it and then bounced it back to me. So this was sort of my experience as a young person. I was always challenged, at school, got thrown out of school for challenging a principal when they were being abusive of one of my schoolmates. I was always sort of getting into this kind of righteous trouble. And he really helped me figure out the valuable part of that instead of repressing it or just glamorizing it as I'm a rebel. And, he helped me sort of sort things out.
I wonder if to come in at that point, I think it's interesting to then think about how marriage and family and home lives and so on, and these father-son and father-daughter relations pan out, because my own father was the oldest surviving brother of a family of 9 himself. And I would describe him as very patriarchal in his attitudes now. And by chance, he got married late. He got married in his 40s, and he had 9 children, but the first 5 children were daughters. So he had 5 daughters and then 4 sons, and I was the 7th in that position. So the time I was entering adulthood, my father was in his late 60s, going into his 70s, and had retired. And my sisters used to say we were the lucky ones. The boys were the lucky ones because you got this mellow figure, but we didn't seem so mellow when we were growing up. But my father was very abstinent himself. He didn't smoke or drink. He set quite high standards, not morally. I mean, he wasn't particularly, he wasn't in any way religious, but he was quite, but politically and in terms of other kinds of standards of living in politics, he was quite intolerant of things. And a favourite rejoinder of his was "shut up." which we found to be very effective. And otherwise, we grew up in a house full of talk and of political talk. But my father knew more because he had been there, done that, and read so much. And he would, like you, Dov, he would tell us to read more. But unlike Jim Higgins, he was quite patriarchal. My mother was a more passive member of the Communist Party. She was kind of matriarch in her own right, and obviously she had her sisters and her 5 daughters and so on. So it was quite, in that sense, it was quite a matriarchal household. But my father was definitely a kind of authoritarian figure and a kind of the person who said no, if you like. And I think that's something that you go, and I was very interested in what Dov was saying towards the end about generations, because I think, and maybe Jeanette would say the same now, you come back towards the end of your own, or in the direction of the end of your own life, and you double back and begin to understand, as I did when I put my father's story together as part of a collection of 4 different stories about brigaders. I realised how much they had in common, and how interconnected those lives were. But also you realise that there was trauma there. There was obviously poverty, there was difficulty and challenges of all kinds, and that there was an aftermath to that you didn't really appreciate, in your later life, and all the thing about seeing people shot in front of their eyes, and all the killing that went on, and all the survival that went on. You don't appreciate that when you're a teenager or 20, but later, and especially after the death of a father, you begin to see them. You look at old photographs and you suddenly tune into that person that they were in the 1930s and so on, and that makes a lot of things not just forgivable but really understandable in terms of the shape that their life took, and how open-minded they were in some ways, but how argumentative they could be. And my father never wanted me to leave the house until he defeated me in an argument. So I sometimes yielded. This was after I was at uni, and after I was a professor at the uni, I would go by and he would put me right in a few things, because he had, and in a way, when I was teaching full time, he had more time to read about current affairs than I ever had. So he'd always done his homework, and he would be tripping me up all over the place. But maybe, since Duff mentioned it, this brings us to the where now, because I realise we've been through some of the points we were going to discuss and double back around our attitude to our parents and so on, and we can still do that. But one of the questions that had been put to us was about the politics of the here and now. Where is the left now? What is happening in society and politics today, with identity politics, with surveillance, with Antifa or anti-fascism, with the idea of wokeness. And I'm especially interested in what it means to be an anti-fascist, because our fathers fought Franco, and our fathers were anti-fascists and activists of a very particular kind. And even listening to that video discussion at the beginning, at the top of our discussion, I was thinking about what these words like activist, what they mean now, and what it means to say you're anti-fascist. We knew what it meant for our fathers. It meant literally putting your life on the line in a large a body of other volunteers, and risking your life to fight fascism. Fascism in a sense of Hitler, Mussolini, Franco, that you can kind of maybe in a simplified form than what people might later think of as the extensiveness of fascist thought or politics. But I just wondered about, what do we think? I mean, what we can say what our own views are, but how do we think our parents, our fathers would have approached the current climate, if you like? And I'm thinking especially of the climate around censorship and control of speech. I've always said to people that the right wing generally controls the media. So censorship is a wonderful thing for them, because however many voices are stifled, it won't be theirs. But I think that issue of what can be said, what cannot be said, and what the language of politics is. We have our own views, but I just wondered, Jeanette, first of all, if you could say, where do you think Jim Higgins would have stood on some of the recent developments?
Well, referring back to that clip at the beginning, I actually wrote down the sentence that stood out for me, is that today's left is not coming from the grassroots, blue collar, Rust Belt union world. And I think that my father would have realized that long before I did, because he had such a sense of what that world was. And he died in 82. And, you know, it started slipping away shortly after that. I mean, or even before, unions had, there were fewer unionized people in Canada, for example, and that just kept continuing. Now the unions are unions of the middle class pretty well. They're not unions of the working class. And I think that he would have recognized that. I just think he would have seen through things just long before I did. And I've only done it really since his book was published, you know, and I think that a huge group of people in the middle who, you know, aren't far left and aren't far right, really aren't aware of what's going on today. And I would take issue with the media being closed, comprised of, you know, supported by right wing. I think that the media is splintered, and there's right-wing media, there's left-wing media, but a lot of the mainstream media is speaking this message of identity politics. That's where it's coming from. And so I just think he would have seen through it. He would have seen the role of capitalism, I think. I'm just now realizing that capitalism has a lot to do with identity politics. They're the puppet masters. They can make money through this. So big pharma and big tech.
I was about to say big pharma, so I'm glad you mentioned big pharma. Big pharma wants a wife, because big pharma is definitely a large part of what's going on. So the three things, I would just point to three things that you stress were class, the importance of class politics and the sidelining of class politics and grassroots politics, history, so knowing what's happened and examples of this in the past, we've lost our memory. And then thirdly, you've absolutely said it, follow the money. Look at what are the economics, what's the material base, who's likely to profit. And the one thing, only one thing I would take issue that you said is about the media, because I mean, the media is largely owned by the right. Certainly that's the case in the UK. The big press barons and media owners are right wing. They play about with, they know the things that will divide the left, so they promote them. They know the things that will divide the left and they promote them. At the same time, they know that their own hardcore right won't be tampered with or in any way affected by it. So I think the media by and large, whether it's social media, corporate media, is owned by and so on the right. How it then manipulates and conceals things, because it conceals from people the fact that big pharma stands to gain from many of the things that are currently being pushed upon us. And I think you're absolutely right. The economics of that, your third point there, I think is really crucial. And you don't hear it. The so-called left, who are supposed to be informed about capitalism, don't seem to be woke enough to realise how much capitalism is at play in the current, ageist, misogynist, homophobic weaponizing of certain kinds of forms of individualism against collective, communal, and other kinds of activist politics as we would see it. But Dov, do you want to say where you think?
Sure. Okay. Well, I have trouble separating his thought from my own, because we talked about these things so much, and I think we agreed in large part. I thought I should read these two quotes. One's from him and one's from Adolph Reed Jr., which I wish I had found this while my dad was still alive, because he would have loved this. So this is Adolph Reed Jr. quoting his dad. So a little intergenerational wisdom here. Ideology is the mechanism that harmonizes the principles that you want to believe with what advances your material interests. And I think, I mean, that's a bit of a mouthful, but I think that really explains a lot of these dynamics. You know, if you're talking about working people fighting for, let's say, back in the 20s and 30s for, you know, limited hours of work, you know, to have some weekend with their family, or to have some sort of guarantee of compensation if they're injured at work, or, you know, any of these basic or labor issues that were won back then. Well, they wanted to believe that they could work less, you know, have a more reasonable work relations, and that actually corresponded with their material interest. Like, those were the same thing. There wasn't some kind of giant gap there that required a lot of negotiating or obfuscating of certain things. It was a pretty clear connection. And the quote I read from my dad would be, how did it go? Let's see, I have it somewhere here. I wrote it down. Art is not a, I'm sorry, politics is not a science. It's an art. It's the art of mob psychology. And well, it's a little bit of a, you know, he's just playing around a little bit there, but I think that's a value as well, because there, whether what is popular and widely distributed and widely like taken up by people and advocated for and replicated, you know, in terms of people making political claims, works or doesn't work, is good or isn't good, serves the broadest number of people or working class, or some kind of idea of social justice, it tends to be not a bunch of individuals really thinking it through carefully. It tends to be a lot of people following some prescription. The quality of that prescriptions, you know, might differ a lot, but I'm sure that's true even if you went back and looked at union organizing back in the day. It wasn't that everybody on the shop floor was going home at night and really busting their brain trying to figure out, you know, what the proper tactics, strategy, framing, values were. They were saying, that sounds good. I'm in. I'm willing to jump in on that. That serves my interest. That makes sense to me. So I think applying that to these times, there's clearly trends, for lack of a better word, and they're a little bit, as they say on the internet, viral, take hold of people. My guess is the ones that really take hold conform to this Adolph Reed Sr.'s concept, that people sense that this both expresses the values they want to claim or want to, you know, take that position, like some kind of virtue signal, let's say, with their actual material interests, which might be, let's say, being managerial class or being professionals, or as Max and Christian were saying, you know, educated, or, you know, the class part. So I think that my dad would think that all made sense. And I don't think this stuff is as new as some people think. I think it goes in the 80s when we were organizing together, doing work in Nicaragua. He and I, and when I was down there, there was already going on. There were people showing up from all over the place, coming to Nicaragua and talking about the war there, the Contra War, the revolution, all the projects that were, you know, the wide range of things people were doing there, organizing going on, and really framing it around their identity, how it like made them feel, or what it was very, I remember being really struck by this. I was like, first of all, you're not Nicaraguan. This is not your, you know, you're coming here maybe to help or just to hang out and be cool. These aren't your struggles. How is this about you? So I spent a lot of time back then thinking about this, and these would tend to be college kids coming from Europe, coming from the United States.
This is like gap year politics, and I think you've actually added three further aspects to those that Jeanette mentioned. And when Jeanette mentioned sort of history, class politics, and economics, you've brought in ideology psychology and, if you like, the self and the self-centered, self-obsessed, self-regarding, self-proclaiming activists. And I think that idea, I mean, I hear people calling themselves activists now that are really, you know, utterly inactive. If anything, they're apologists, or they should be apologizing. And I think that's so I think the words themselves have become kind of a sloppily treated. And I think those three ideas, ideology, and anyone who's on the left should really be thinking straight away, who benefits here? What is the state doing? What is capitalism doing? What companies are profiting? You know, who are the who's involved here, and what is the ideology, and who's behind it? I think that, I mean, one thing I would say, I always try to get the good out of whatever's bad. And recently, because I work on history and a bit of the history of language, I've tried to say, okay, there's a word woke. Where did it come from? How did it come about? There's a word whataboutery. Where did it come from? What's it about? There's a word, even fascism, thinking about definitions of fascism and people that want to close it up in certain times, and those people that want to run it all over the place. So I think becoming more engaged and learning to talk about these things in ways that aren't trapped in the past, or that try to stay open to what's happening now. And I think a big issue around that is the issue of censorship, which seems to me to have a very long history in terms of shutting down debate. And something I think that Dove said about people disagreeing, about disagreement. I think disagreement, dialectic, is really fruitful, and it's always been there. My father talked about the men in the prison camp in Spain in 1937 still arguing among themselves about causes and consequences of the war, about the correct strategy, about who was responsible for them, whether they trusted the officers, the more middle class people among them, and so on, and what the party was doing and whether it was right, and so on. So that constant argumentation, out of that come kind of lines of strength, if you like. You know, you might say ideological or but political lines of strength. And I think one of the things that happens when you shut down debate is you don't get a chance for that ferment. I mean, I work on John Milton in the 17th century, and you see a lot of those debates then, that even people feared that if you had censorship on a wide scale, you would lose your own voice. Because if it was just a question of, I just want to shut down people I don't agree with, but it never, you know, it often has a detrimental effect on politics and progressive politics and political advancement. So I think that idea of if we do connect in some ways the current trends and the politics of the self, which are about closing down debate and about, if you like, identity politics as self-identity and not as social identity or and so on, that kind of, or political identity. I think that's something which has been which is an obstacle in the path of the kind of intense debate that occurred in the 20s and 30s when our fathers were you know, in if you like, informed and enraged by social injustice, which and my father always read across the press, so he didn't. I mean, my father listened to as many. In fact, when he was a young man, the older men in the street used to say to him, "Jim, could you go along to this meeting here and tell us what people are saying?" Because he was very good at reporting back, you know, kind of verbatim what people had said, and then people would then make judgments on, because there was the anarchist, the Independent Labour Party, various kinds of socialists, the Labour Party, the Communist Party, and like I think what Jeanette was saying about Jim, they tuned into the line that they thought was most persuasive or convincing, but they passed through those other views. So I think being able to listen to other views and engage with them and not feel that debate's been closed down, I would say that's really important. What would our fathers think now of the political landscape and the language of politics today, and then maybe how that would impact on or be different from your own take on the politics of the present?
Well, as I had said, I think he would have cottoned on to things far faster than I, because anti-fascist for him meant fighting for democracy. Fighting for democracy, in 2020, I realized that that is the only name for his book, because that's what he was doing. And democracy involves debate and the right to free expression, and governments where, you know, different parties are fighting it out and they don't all have a common agenda. I go back to, I'd referenced an election campaign he chaired in 1939 in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. And that is where he had known a Presbyterian minister there, and the Presbyterian minister had helped getting aid out to the veterans across the prairies. My father was responsible for aid to the Spanish Civil War veterans across the prairies, which only came from public support because the government ignored them. And the Presbyterian minister became the candidate in what was called the United Reform Movement. And it's an historic election in Canada. And it's the only time it's the only time that all the parties on the left and groups on the left came together to beat a liberal incumbent. And that involved the Communist Party, the CCF, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation that he was part of, ethnic groups. There were two large ethnic groups there. And interestingly, the Social Credit Party, which was a populist party. They all came together and voted together. And he chaired the campaign for that. And I think he was picked as campaign chair because the Presbyterian minister knew that their values aligned on this united left business. So fast forward to today, the left is about as divided as it ever has, except one part of the left has been shut down. We haven't been allowed to speak, and I'm speaking for myself. We've have self-censored in big ways, and it is not conducive to democracy. What's happened with the left on today, and to go back to that populist party joining with the left, what could happen today? In the United States, the latest figures are that 50% of registered voters are independent. So 25% are Dems, Democrats, 25% are Republicans. There's a huge number in the middle that are independents. They're going to make a decision which way to go. In the United States, it's the Republicans, the people on the right, not necessarily the far right, that are talking about these issues that those of us on the left don't feel we can talk about. So what's going to happen with those voters? So many people that I've run into, and I've only learned so much through Twitter. We've all come from the left. The people I follow from Twitter are on the left. They are politically homeless today because they do not see that the left represents them. And so I think that's an opportunity for people on the right to bring people in. Now abortion has entered the debate in the US. And so the Democrats have a very strong force keeping the left and women and so on in their camp. So anyway, it's going to be very interesting to me to see how all this plays out. I don't know, the surveillance kept the left down. Our father's left down. It was, in my case, RCMP surveillance. I found out he was surveilled monthly when I was growing up. So that was obviously why we never learned his story. We couldn't be chatting to neighbors about his experiences in the Spanish Civil War because our neighbors were being queried about him. Surveillance today is very different. It happens online. there are lots of things to be concerned about around uh, the uh, the abilities of technology to surveil anybody who has wrongthink. And you know, I asked at my local bookstore yesterday for 1984. In particular, I wanted a recent version that was published that the two designers of the cover won an award for. And what it is, 1984, the words are redacted on the cover. It was a brilliant cover. They won an award for it. They couldn't get it. They think it's out of print or something. Anyway, I'm going to try and track it down and read it again, because there is all of this thing about language and how things mean the opposite to what they used to mean, or something totally different. So it's today it's a victim politics. Identity politics is all about being a victim. And I think that the politics of our fathers left, and certainly of my left, was about the common good. And we are not dealing with the working class anymore. The working class is homeless. They're in jails. They're not being listened to when they try to express something, as they did in Canada with the truckers convoy. That was viewed as right wing. I don't know. I think there were people, you know, if that's the working class and they're right wing, we got to be concerned about that.
Those are fantastic points. There's just so much to pick up on there, and I think because my mind is buzzing so much, I'll hand over to Dov.
Well, this is the topic. This is such a huge one, and I think about this a lot, like last 10 years, a lot. So I have too much to say. I'm trying to think of a few things I could share that are coherent. I think, and I'm just going to speak for myself, I think, because my dad and I, we talked about this stuff all the time. I mean, obviously not in the last 15 years, we didn't talk except in my imagination, but he would agree with a lot of this. A lot of my thinking would be, you know, gleaned from his own insights. So it's just, I think I can go better that way. In the 60s, I hate to use decade talk, but in the 60s, nonetheless, we know what that means. There was a lot of activism, but it was also tied up and, I don't know, kind of merged with something that's not exactly activism, but which was experienced by some people as activism, which was the counterculture. So you had people, you know, college kids, let's say in the United States, going down to the South, some of them getting killed, beaten up. You had college kids dressing up and listening to rock music, and you know, having a certain sense of affinity, a certain sense of, yes, I want to hang out, you know, I like everybody. I'm not a bigot. And I want to live a different life than my parents. They're the problem, the old people with their ways, and you know, the old order. We're gonna wear bangles and you know, whatever, hippie clothes, and like that's gonna be a revolution or something. And a lot of people actually felt that way. They actually thought that way. And there was a sort of a second wave of this with punk rock in the late 70s and the 80s, where expressing disaffection, and through clothes and through, you know, social affiliation or whatever, is seen as like inherently a political, like this has some content to it. I mean, it has some content, but it has some weight to it that will actually change social relations. People kind of believed that, even though not too many people talked about it openly. And I think in both cases, and this continues to go on now, I think, with being like, maybe you could talk about being woke this way as a sort of posture you adopt, certain kind of language use, certain musical preference, whatever, different things you do to indicate that you are in this affiliation, and that this affiliation is calling out, calling to, you know, pointing out and addressing is a key word, these obvious social wrongs, when it actually doesn't have any necessarily material impact on any of it.
Yeah.
And yet adopting the language, adopting the clothes or the whatever it is, the expressions, allows someone to feel that they are, expressing their values.
Yeah, that's good, because it's like badge and t-shirt activism, and I think the terms you were using, posture, there is so important, as is lifestyle choice, activism as a lifestyle choice rather than as a politically engaged a practice. I just want to mention one thing quickly, because Jeanette mentioned 1984, and I was thinking of all the literature we need now. People say we should be teaching The Crucible, we should be teaching Lord of the Flies, we should be teaching a Fahrenheit 451, we should be teaching Animal Farm and so on, because we should be teaching all those texts that are warnings of a kind of totalitarianism that can come along and take away not just your rights, but the right to discuss your rights, or to talk about certain rights, like, for example, women's rights. So, but I think that idea of, it goes back to the hippies, or to those, that idea of fashion, culture, music, alternative lifestyles as, alternative ways of being that become an end in themselves, and are then detached both from what's to come and become kind of generational dead cul-de-sacs in some ways. So I think that there is that issue of that. I think we've all shared something, which is we've got a backstory, and that backstory is our father's biographies, which probably takes us back about 120 years, I would say, in terms of thinking about those life stories. And because that's a history that we've got access to through our fathers, we have that long view. And I think what's been shut down more than anything in the last few years is the long view, both by changes in language and then by this sense. And that in the lead up to the Trump election in 2016, I met 3 Clinton supporting couples in Spain on the same 2-week vacation, from completely different parts of the States, different backgrounds, different kinds of different people, very different kinds of voters, but they were all Clinton supporters, and they all said the same thing. They all said that Trump was going to get in, and they all said the Clintons were crooks. And those things shocked me as a independent supporting a Scottish subject of the British imperial monarchy. It shocked me that they would be so casually predicting a victory for Trump. But I think they saw I think they saw how deep the divisions were. They saw how shut up, boxed, silenced, and ruined the working class were. And I think it was some of those same political conditions that led to Brexit in the UK, to this catastrophic economic suicide that the British state was willing to commit for the sake of a few tax dodgers and big companies and so on, corporate culture, and for a xenophobic racism, which was also tied up with that economic, bad. If you were a good capitalist, you knew that having a market of 500 million in your doorstep was a good thing. To say goodbye to that was an act of self-harm, but it was also like the chaos capitalism, the capriciousness, the FU ideology of the times. And I think when you take the working class out of politics, when you make them politically hopeless, and when they become cynical, sharp enough to see through false alternatives, that's when you get all kinds of dangerous scenarios emerging. So I do think that to exclude so many people from the, if you like, from the political sphere, which I think has happened, I think is extremely serious and damaging consequences. And then you get the representatives of what gets called activism is actually a very thin crust, if you like. It's not at all the pie. And another thing that was in that short video was the word, and I mean, I'm interested in intersectionality, because my dream is that one day we'll have it. Because intersectionality, if it exists, is a recognition of the non-hierarchical nature of a whole series of differences and discriminations and identities. It's when one identity comes along and sits on top of the others, or when you start getting a ladder system or a hierarchy, that problems arise, and you have to balance at certain times. You have to balance rights, the principle of no platform for, say, fascism, alongside the right to free speech. How do you balance certain things to do with no platforming and free speech. And John Milton had a very good line, because he basically said, who decides? I mean, say I don't like Jeanette's opinion, I can say I don't want to hear it. But then what if that a year later that turns out to have been my opinion? And then who if I allow this to be the general situation, how can I stop myself from being silenced? So I think it's the judgmentalism, especially of social media today, that instead of diversifying opinion, it's solidified and congealed opinion. It's not given rise to it. That's to do with the algorithms and so on. It can all be worked out by people who understand how communication works. But I think it's definitely closed down. There's been a closing down of debate. Basically, there's cats and memes, and then there's the silence that a lot, and like Jeanette, I know a lot of people, especially working class people, who are happen to be in the humanities or whatever, in universities and so on, but elsewhere, who do feel that the policing of language has reached a really critical stage, and what happens next might be a kind of blowing open of those doors, because I think there's a kind of uncontainable situation around the if you like, the containment that's been visited upon the culture. Dov, do you want to add anything here?
Well, I was just thinking about what you're saying, that the about one of the thoughts I had was that because I get into a lot of discussions. I have two grown daughters in their 20s. They're both very politically astute, radical young people, and we get into some serious debates, keeping the family tradition alive. And the idea of words as potential like harmful, that language can be harmful, is one of the things we've discussed a lot. And when I first heard this, I was like, that's ridiculous. But then I had to kind of back up and think, well, no, that's actually happened to me. Like, I've been maligned before, personal story I won't tell, but where it was, I mean, seriously, in my personal life, I got canceled. Let's put it that way. Not publicly but in my social environment, to some extent. And it was brutal. It was one of the worst things I ever went through. Well, language can do that. And language, a parent or teachers, a single comment to a kid they'll be thinking about this 40 years later, still struggling with some sort of internalized, disability that they took on because it hit them a certain way. It's not completely ridiculous to say language can be harmful and that it can be worse than physical violence. I would have taken a severe beating over what happened to me, the one thing I was referencing. So at the same time, this is, I guess, kind of weaponized politically, the idea that language can be harmful, in the service of censorship. And so I've been struggling with this. How do you differentiate between like debate or an area in which people can disagree, can contribute ideas, can listen and be open to other people's thoughts and opinions, however frustrating or upsetting those opinions might be, as opposed to treating language as harmful and therefore trying to shut it down. And I think it comes down to personal, like if it's personal. So if somebody wants to discuss abortion or they want to discuss, it doesn't, take any topic. And we're not talking about each other specifically, even though the topic has implications for maybe everyone, or maybe more for one party or another, that can be separated from like sort of ad hominem attack or, and that's where identity politics gets really tricky, because when we identify, when we're all about our identity as like, I'm a Jew, if you say something about Jews, I am offended, or this ties in with historical oppression, and therefore I'm going to try to shut you up. Instead of saying, well, you have an opinion about Jews or whatever, you're going to have it whether I like it or not. I'm curious to hear it. You're not actually attacking me right now. Like, how do we separate that thing? And one thought I had about this morning was that maybe, like free speech is a little bit of a misnomer for me. Free speech is really about tolerance. Like my ability to give you both full free speech without like trying to, shut you down or silence you or not plug my ears is about my ability to tolerate discomfort or tolerate a thought or an opinion, an expression I find offensive or upsetting or triggers me or whatever. And there's a limit for everybody. I think everyone has a limit where you just go, I can't listen to this, So where do we get that from? And I thought, I think we might get that from our childhood, or at least that's where it might start. We're not born tolerant. We're not born with any particular capacity in that sense. I think we might learn this from the adults we're around. And when adults listen to kids, teachers, parents, whoever, or older siblings or whoever, people with bigger people listen to you, you learn to, you feel heard, you learn to maybe listen to them too. Like I feel like I got a lot of this with my dad. Like we had some epic fights and he could be a little nasty and he was a powerful person, like a powerful intellect and powerful personality. But in the end, he heard me out. And I think I learned a lot for myself about being able to listen and tolerate discomforture and just in discussion from being heard and from listening and sort of that give and take. And it's like a muscle that you develop. I don't think it's innate. I don't think it's a natural thing. I think it might be something we have to work at and especially be assisted at in terms of our education, both informal at home and maybe informally at school, like how school is structured, how teachers treat children. So anyway.
I think that generational aspect of, because I think it cuts both ways because it is a dialectic. I think we live in a very ageist culture where elders and where older people are not listened to, and that's part of it because history is not looked at. So I think we have to look both ways and think, yes, we have to understand that young people will have the kind of feelings we had about the generationally and about our fathers, those differences when we were younger. But I think you almost spoke to a paradox there, and the paradox is this: language matters. Words hurt. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. But in fact, we know that words can hurt you more than sticks and stones, as you've said. But I think that sensitivity to language, and even hypersensitivity to language, to being triggered and so on, that sensitivity to language is not itself language awareness or linguistics or literary awareness or historical awareness. So I think people are aware of a small selection of certain words that they find problematic. They're not aware of the longer history of language as something which has evolved, these terms. And I find that, and I can throw one out here and say, for me, the 17th century witch hunts were not very far away from the misogyny of the 17th century. And there's a reason why there isn't a male equivalent for the word TERF. There isn't a male equivalent for the word TERF. There isn't, because it's rooted in misogyny, and it's rooted in a misogyny that goes back a very, very long way. 40 years ago, I had a politics lecturer, a woman, a feminist, and she left us with 2 points. The 2 points she left us with were there are more derogatory terms for women than there are for men. And secondly, if it came to a knockdown fight, generally speaking, on average, the man would win. So those were the 2 things she left that large lecture theatre with 40 years ago. And I think that sense of men's physical strengths and and this is what it's even one of the definitions of fascism, is the crushing of women's rights and misogyny. It's one of the aspects of elements supposedly of a definition of fascism. So I think women's rights for me are non-negotiable, among other things, are non-negotiable. And then obviously other kinds of rights come along, and then you have to start doing the negotiating and the balancing and the discussion and the debate and the dialectic. But the concept of no debate is simply a non-starter. Politically, it's a non-starter. There can't be no debate because, as a famous philosopher once said, if you don't debate something, you don't recognise it when it's happening again. And that applies to all kinds of historical events of the most catastrophic and awful nature. If you don't look into them, if you don't lift the lid on them, if you don't listen to the different views that were around and see how they happened, how these things came about. It's like violence has a history. and political violence has a history, and fascism has a history, whether people root it in Versailles or recently the major historian of the Spanish Civil War, Paul Preston, has argued that the Spanish Civil War was a colonial war because it was the defeat of Spain and the loss of Spanish colonies that led to this vengeance trip by the army on the Spanish proletariat. That's Paul Preston's argument, that really this comes out of North Africa, that it's not just I feel like a civil war or revolution. It's actually got it's got colonial roots. It's got roots in North Africa and Spain, Germany, France, and Britain's various manoeuvrings around Morocco and North Africa. And I think that idea of empire, the underpinnings of empire, is really important, and understanding the effects of these bigger histories. That's why I'm very much against the word whataboutery, because whataboutery is my version of comparative politics. And people would always have said in the 1930s, you know, you see what the Italians are doing here, this is what the Spanish are doing here, why is Germany here? And they would make those connections. And the poets like Langston Hughes and their poetry made those connections between different struggles. They connected different struggles. The Jewish volunteers who went from Germany to Spain, there's a fantastic documentary about this, talked about how they felt they'd lost in Germany, but they weren't going to lose in Spain. They were going to go there and fight. And I think that sense of comparison, comradeship, solidarity, looking over the fence into those other areas and having empathy, you know, I would say other identifying politics, I think is so much more important than being locked into this sense of self and a sensitive self, which is supposedly linguistically aware, but is actually just sensitive to a very small set of lexical items or names or words. That's my view.
Well, empathy has gone missing. I think we have been told to be kind. And empathy, I have come to realize, is totally separate from what is meant by be kind. Be kind means don't speak up.
Be quiet. Be kind
Yes,
means
be
quiet.
quiet. You know, it's like little girls were told to be, you know, polite and
Seen but not heard.
submissive and you know, those things really never go away. We fought that in the 60s and 70s with the women's rights movement, but now I think a lot of women are feeling shut up. And as for the word TERF, I think that, you know, women are starting to take that on and owning it, and that men are calling themselves TERFs as well. So it's kind of, you know, that idea of with the language dissipating the impact of it on you, not to take it personally, and to get beyond that. And I wanted to talk about Antifa because I did not realize what Antifa was. Antifa and neo-fascists are just flip sides of the same coin. And the problem is that Antifa has become the enforcers for the mob that shuts down, for example, women's voices in New Zealand recently. And I'm very pleased that Nadine Strawson, who is the keynote speaker for this wonderful plebiscite conference that I'm so delighted and honored to be part of, was invited to talk about free speech in New Zealand. And everywhere she went, she was able to talk to people about what it meant for free speech, and that the mob, which was quite violent and intimidating, they injured women. These were just women who wanted to speak. They wanted to talk about themselves, their experiences. The point was they could talk about anything they wanted to. They were just given a microphone and they could talk. And because women have been repressed for so long, the women who had ideas and thoughts and so on in the recent past, there are women who were bravely coming forward to these events. It was shut down. And what the Nadine Strawson talked about was you're not exercising your right to free speech when you're part of the mob shutting someone down. This is not the heckler's veto, or it is, I don't know, maybe I don't have heckler's veto sorted out quite yet. But it is when you completely shut down someone from speaking, then you're on the wrong side. And no woman was allowed to say one word at that event. And Antifa would be the enforcers. And the people who you look at that crowd, they were all young, white, university student kids that looked like middle class kids who were coming in on these women. So I think this is a problem we've got to get sorted out, because authoritarianism is on the rise. And in Canada, my own government is enacting legislation on the sly, which is affecting women's rights, has affected women's rights already. And so it's something we have to address.
Yeah, and I think the thing you touched on there was really something that links all of us, and it goes right back to the beginning of this discussion, and that is Antifa. Antifa, I think, probably, if you look into it, has complex and divided roots in different areas, but Antifa as an abbreviation of anti-fascist has no relation whatsoever to what our fathers understand as anti-fascism would be. It's not putting on a mask and attacking women who want to even speak in a venue where it's only women who are speaking and listening to each other. There's nothing anti-fascist about that. So I think that Antifa is a problem, and I think the language has become so corrupted on the one hand and so policed and restricted on the other that we shouldn't be, and I even think left and right now are such problematic terms, because if people can call themselves anti-fascists who are essentially attacking women, especially privileged middle class men attacking women, it's just such a complete outrage that you have to say, we have to go back, we have to dismantle this, and we have to rethink the language that we use, or we have to do what we've done in our books and in our discussions and conversations and remind people of what it actually means to be anti-fascist, because it's not a tweet and it's not a heckle or a shouting down of people whose informed views you do not wish to hear. Duff?
The problem with this discussion around Antifa is Antifa doesn't really exist. It's like it's an affiliation to a nothing. So here in Europe, where Antifa has its origins, like in the United States, like in Berkeley, where I live, in the Bay Area, there's a bunch of people that are involved in this, and I know quite a few of them, and who would identify that way, although they won't say this to most people. They take their inspiration from the European Autonomen, and I know a little bit about through my wife and some of the anarchists I know here, but and here it's quite different. There's certainly not a strong strain of like anti-free speech or like shutting down talks or something. It's more about militants, like street militancy, squaring off with police, doing evictions, for instance, on squats, stuff like this, going to a G8 thing and trying to shut down the proceedings. So it's actually more of a street protest, affinity groups, quite militant, quite secretive, quite concerned with over-policing, very focused on the police state questions. In the United States, this is kind of bled over into social justice warriors who want to do exactly what you were talking about, Jeanette, want to disrupt people having meetings, giving talks, presenting ideas that they find objectionable. It's not descriptive of everybody who might claim an identity as being involved in Antifa. And you'll really have trouble meeting somebody who says, I'm Antifa. There's no sign up, there's no organization. No. It's really about tactics. but the tactic is, I don't disclose my identity. I dress in nondescript black clothing like everybody else, and therefore make it hard for me to be policed is the original reason for this, to make myself not identifiable from anybody else. Those same tactics are being applied by people, and even the mantle of Antifa being claimed by people who are opposing open discourse. Yeah, which is, I mean, it is Orwellian. It's perfectly Orwellian. But I think it'd be good to maintain a little bit of, like, not too broad of a brush, but a very pointed and strong brush to say what you're saying. I totally agree with you. And this gets back to the language. Language is harmful. The notion, which cannot be fully disputed, that language leads to violence. Language leads to oppression. This comes out of the collegiate fascination with, like, people like Foucault and others who talked about power being dispersive. It's not just the government that has power. It's in the way we talk. It's in the way we describe reality. It's in what's normative. It's in what's never said. It's in things we all take for granted, like, fish take the water they swim in for granted. That oppression is imbued into these things, which is not a ridiculous idea. It's a great idea, actually. I really think he's great. But this has been taken up and sort of weaponized as well, then to fix the problem, we have to police people's language. And we have to, challenge oppression at the linguistic level, what we determine as oppression at the linguistic level, instead of at some sort of structural, legal, political, social level. Although you can't take these things apart. I mean, you can't take language and politics, really, they're not separable at some point. So anyway, I'm totally with you in spirit on this question of, like, people should be able to have meetings, talk about what they want to talk about, and people that don't want to be there shouldn't go. and people that want to protest what is being proffered there should do so thoughtfully, should do through persuasion, do so through rebuttal, right? I completely agree, and it just, like, horrifies me every time one of these things. And a lot of this happens where I live. There's a lot of this policing of meetings and whatnot. So it just, like, totally infuriates me. It's very difficult. I talk to people that do this kind of stuff. I know people that try to shut these things down. And it is incredibly difficult to convince them. There's like a religious conviction about this language question. It's a little bit like if you were talking to a, dyed-in-the-wool Catholic about something that's, indisputable Catholic doctrine. They just say, I can't, it's beyond discussion. It's just true. And not to pick on Catholics, but just,
But that's a really good point.
The Pope said so.
That's a good point to make, because it is like a new evangelism, just as people talk about a new McCarthyism. So there's a new evangelism, there's a post-secular fundamentalism, if you like, and it is about, this is a belief, this is my faith, and you can't say anything that might in any way threaten to shake it or challenge it. So I think that idea, we think we're a more secular society than we are, and working in the 17th century, I see a lot of parallels between what's happening now and what was happening in the 1640s. With censorship and sectarianism and interference of various kinds, and people with very unshifting views who didn't want to hear or listen to other opinions.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's an intolerant and aggressive quality. I've had a lot of these conversations with my daughters and their friends. I mean, I know a lot of people that we would be discussing right now. I work at an info shop. I'm around a lot of anarchists. And this stuff it's really hard for me to talk sometimes to people and express my feelings or my beliefs or even questions I have, because I don't want to get in a full-scale war with people I have social relations. I don't completely shut my mouth because I'm constitutionally incapable of it. But I also want to pick battles and not, just blow everything up all the time. Anyway, I think I discern that there are foundational problems. So it's easy to get caught up. Like the turf stuff is like this to me. It's like I spent so much time thinking about this and trying to sort out my own thoughts and like what is actually going on here. And I think that most of the fighting, most of the debate, the heated, the confrontations are happening sort of like up here, but the actual problem or disagreement or fundamental thing that might need to be sorted out is below it. And it's so there's a lot of energy, but there's not a lot of progress in terms of understanding. And one of the things, and I'll shut up. One of the things I really, really try to teach my daughters, I don't think fully successfully, but it's an ongoing project, is to separate empathy and sympathy, to really distinguish these two concepts. And people don't. Empathy is, you don't hear sympathy too often, except for like, you don't hear it in political context or not too much. People use empathy. And I think I'm correct. Maybe Willie knows more about the English language than I do, but empathy is not, I feel that way. It's that I can understand that.
Putting yourself in another shoes is the way my
or
father
at least attempting to say, well, what is it that you're saying? What I'm looking through your eyes, I'm trying to understand why this matters to you, and I'm feeling like I'm allowing myself to have some emotional response to what it is you care about. I might find you reprehensible in some way. I might not in the end agree with you at all, but I can still practice this. Sympathy would be like, yeah, I feel that way too. Like I feel this way about, we are all in sympathy about this shutting down of people having meetings, want to discuss things like women's rights or something. We all feel sympathetic with those people, with each other. But I have some empathy for the language police. I disagree with them completely, but I know some of them. I feel what's going on. I sense this there's a desperation there. And I think that's true of a lot of fascists as well. Or not fascists in the formal sense, but people who are attracted to fascistic idea. People who are attracted to like white nationalism, for example, in the United States. I get it. Like, it doesn't seem completely insane to me. It seems ignorant in many ways.
Yeah.
It seems unfortunate and it doesn't seem like a viable plan either. And we talk about like what could actually move our interests forward individually and communally. It doesn't seem like that's going to work out very good. But I kind of get it. And I get that about a lot of, anyway, I almost feel like I was listening to this guy, Walter Kern, the other day, and he said, the reason I could never be a politician is because I'm a good listener. And every time I talk to someone, I end up kind of understanding where they're coming from and agreeing a little bit with them. Yeah. And then the next person I talk to, I feel super. And I thought, yeah, I got a little bit of that too. I come back to myself, but I'm very empathetic that way. But that particular meaning of empathy, I don't think is discussed very much.
Yeah. I think that's really important. I think if you think about education, because I think learning, I feel I've learned a lot in the last couple of hours, an awful lot. And even before I came on to this discussion, I was reading up avidly on definitions of fascism, history of fascism. So I just wanted to remind myself, what is it? How do we talk about it? Why is there this fascism of everyday life, Foucault and so on? I did all of that. And then I was thinking of these terms, Antifa, that kind of spill around and you're not quite sure, you can't pin it down to a particular organ. It's not the International Brigades we're talking about and so on. So I think that learning to be more attentive to language and especially what both of you have said to the importance of listening, but as a pathway to understanding and not just being single-minded about things. I try to do that all the time, and I think it's possible to teach without constantly coming across views that are contrary to your own. And I would say that most of what I've taught and the people that I listen to, I mean, John Milton's actual job working for the Cromwellian state, which was quite a nasty one in so many ways, was to read the opposition. So that's what he did. He read and translated all the European objections to the killing of Charles I and to the existence of this English Republic. That was his job. And I think if you read the opposition, if you read things that you find entirely disagreeable, that will be, as Milton would have said, it would build your character, strengthen your own beliefs and so on, challenge them where they need to be challenged. And I think that's what's really important. And if we did start to listen more, there'd be less of the policing and the shutting down and the paranoia and so on.
I'm wearing a pendant with a honeybee on it. And that is because I rewarded myself when I published my father's book. I wanted something to remember him by. And the most poignant story in the book for me was about how he learned to not be afraid of honeybees. And he was a young child in the orphanage when he learned this from a kindly gardener. And this represents to me the human that he was and how he lived his life. I asked my siblings once for a word that would, single word that would describe him. And one of my siblings came back with the word kind. And in his book, he brings out the stories of others. He was always interested in what others had to say. And he had empathy. And that's what this represents for me, is an empathy. And I did get an empathy from him. And I do want to be kind.
Yeah.
But I don't want to be shut down.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Maybe that's a good note in which to draw things to a close. I think we covered a lot of ground, and as I said, I feel better informed than I was at the beginning, and I've really enjoyed learning about your fathers and about your politics, and I hope that we can continue this discussion in another format sometime soon. So thanks again to Dov and Jeanette.
Yeah. Good to meet you both.
Good to meet you both. This has been a wonderful conversation. To be able to get into a conversation like this is a real, not only a privilege, but kind of unknown to me these days. So thank you very much.
And we're in a kind of what seemed, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and thank you to Plebity.
Yeah, Plebity have done a fantastic job, and we seem in a private space here. It's been an intimate conversation, but obviously there's a public facing dimension to this, which is exciting.